Few historical figures have received as much scholarly attention as Joseph Smith, the Mormon prophet. And this month we are getting a new scholarly biography to add to that pile. John Turner, who previously wrote a phenomenal biography of Brigham Young, is coming out with Joseph Smith, The Rise and Fall of an American Prophet, published by Yale University Press. The official release date is June 17th. So I thought this would be a good opportunity for me to do a video on the literature surrounding Joseph Smith, particularly biographies. I am going to walk you through some of the most important biographies of Joseph Smith over 200 years, but a special focus on the last 70 years or so, to not just give you an overview of the strengths and weaknesses of these different works and let you know which ones I recommend, but also so we can trace a picture of how Joseph Smith's image has evolved in the scholarly imagination. Let's dig in. Now, the desire to write a history about Joseph Smith began with the very day that the LDS tradition was formed. April 6, 1830, Joseph Smith dictated a revelation that said, "There shall be a record kept among you, and in that record it shall testify that Joseph Smith is a prophet, seer, and revelator," putting the devotional framing around how the Mormon tradition expected Joseph Smith to be viewed. And Joseph Smith himself even tried to build on that legacy. 2 years later, he started his first history, an 1832 history that only lasted a few pages. How many of us can relate to starting a big writing project and only getting a few pages in and then stopping? But that first 1832 history was the commencement of autobiographical / biographical treatments of Joseph Smith. It also set the stakes of how people were going to be approaching him, because he centered his revelatory, visionary, and divine experiences, making you have to wrestle with whether he spoke with angels and saw God and translated ancient records from gold plates that were buried in upstate New York. And you get the other side of that equation just a couple of years later in 1834 with the first anti-Mormon book published, Eber D. Howe's Mormonism Unveiled, as you can see from the cover page, featuring an image of Joseph Smith being prodded by the devil. And through those two histories, Joseph Smith's 1832 history and Eber D. Howe's 1834 history, we get the two warring factions of how Joseph Smith is going to be seen, either the divine visionary or the fraudulent imposter who is fooling people. And that framework lasted for over a century in a majority of how books have written about Joseph Smith. Now, the next major biographical treatment didn't come out until a few years later, and it was authored by Joseph Smith's mother, Lucy Mack Smith, who shortly after Joseph Smith's death started narrating her memoir to a set of faithful scribes, who then compiled a lot of those writings, and that weren't always in a clear order, into a memoir that we often know as History of the Joseph Smith as told by his mother. Here you see the first page of the manuscript. It is not published until over a decade later, and it was always controversial. Now, I may do a whole video in the future focused on Lucy Mack Smith's memoir, because I believe it's one of the most poignant religious memoirs in America in the 19th century, and deals with issues of class and religion and gender and belief in phenomenally revealing ways. It was also hated by Brigham Young, and Brigham Young was so mad when it was published by first Orson Pratt and then others in a variety of Mormon traditions, because Brigham Young saw it as a threat to his apostolic lineage and becoming leader of the church, because it centered the Smith family, who, by the way, is now leading the RLDS church by 1860. And so at one point, Brigham Young ordered all copies of Lucy Mack Smith's memoir that were owned by LDS members to be burned. That shows how controversial these biographical treatments can be. I'll quickly touch on a couple other important biographical stories throughout the rest of the 19th century. In 1878, Edward Tulledge published Life of Joseph Smith. Edward Tulledge was a fascinating figure who converts to Mormonism, backslides into atheism, joins Mormonism again, becomes a Godbeite, becomes Mormon, then becomes an RLDS, and becomes Mormon again. Fascinating. Maybe I'll do a video on him in the future. His life of Joseph Smith is a very fascinating, quixotic tale that tries to frame Joseph Smith as this seer, this seeker, this religious wanderer, just like Edward Tullidge was. And an interesting note, when it was first published in 1878, Edward Tullidge was friendly to the LDS Church. He might have been rebaptized a member at that point, and it was very much a pro-LDS tradition narrative. When he then converts to the RLDS Church shortly after, he republishes the book and reframes it as an RLDS story, again showing how malleable the Joseph Smith image can be. And then finally, we get George Q. Cannon's The Life of Joseph Smith the Prophet, published in 1888. That was written while George Q. Cannon was in prison for polygamy. He was a member of the first presidency of the LDS Church. So that kind of shows the stakes of his frame of mind when thinking about Joseph Smith as a sufferer, as someone who is persecuted. And it centers that narrative of persecution at the heart of the story. So those are the important 19th century narratives. Let's now jump into the 20th century. By the way, if you enjoyed this type of scholarly analysis of American religious and Mormon history, please subscribe to this channel if you haven't yet, and like and share this video. I try to, every Friday, post these videos giving you insights into scholarly works on a variety of historical topics so that you yourself can dig into doing your own research. All right, with that aside, let's move into 20th century biographies of Joseph Smith. The first scholarly biography to be written about Joseph Smith was written by a young woman in her 20s named Fawn Brodie. Fawn Brodie came from a prominent LDS family. Her uncle was David O. McKay, an LDS prophet. She did her graduate school at the University of Chicago in English and decided in her late 20s that she wanted to write a biography of Joseph Smith. That was a milestone in scholarship on Joseph Smith and remains quite divisive and also popular today. The title of the biography was "No Man Knows My History," a quote that comes from one of Joseph Smith's final discourses that relate to the fact that much of his history is hidden and controversial and needs to be unearthed. And in many ways, this biography is framed as an expose. This book, published in 1945, remains in print today. I can't emphasize how rare it is for a book that's 80 years old to still be popular. That almost never happens, but it shows the power of this tale as well as the cultural meaning that came from the book, as well as how many people are aching for the type of history and analysis that Fawn Brodie's book offers. Now, there are a number of strengths that go for the book. It is impeccably written. The Mormon tradition has produced very few authors as compelling as Fawn Brodie. And further, she has a clear argument. She argues that Joseph Smith was an opportunist, a fraud, who eventually is able to convince himself that he was a prophet. This confirms how a lot of outsiders view Joseph Smith. Obviously, it's going to draw a lot of critics from within the LDS tradition who don't recognize in that portrait the prophet that they revere as, God's chosen spokesperson. There are also some weaknesses in the volume that I should emphasize. Like most scholars, she did not have access to a lot of the most important sources on Joseph Smith, and she relied on things like the History of the Church series, a set of books that were started by Joseph Smith's own scribes back in the 1840s and then not published until the 20th century, but were very problematic in their origins. You might know them as the History of the Church, and it gives Joseph Smith as the author, but in reality, he did not have much of a say over the actual content. Fawn Brodie ends up being excommunicated as a result of this biography, and it prompts a resurgent apologetic tradition. Hugh Nibley, an eclectic classicist who would soon be hired by BYU, publishes a pamphlet titled "No Ma'am, That's Not History." Yes, the misogyny you can see in the title does pervade most of the work, where it kind of builds this new tradition that's going to last all the way until the present of trying to defend Joseph Smith's ideas against these scholarly critical attacks. And so you again see the same similar stakes that were present all the way from the 1830s of seeing Joseph Smith as this divine prophet, or seeing Joseph Smith as this fraud and an imposter. Now, there are many legacies of Brodie's No Man Knows My History, not just in prompting apologetic responses, but it also prompts a lot of scholarly accounts who may not agree with Fawn Brodie, but recognize that they need to give a workable alternative, a counter narrative that was rooted in the new professionalizing scholarly discourse of the day and could therefore write about Joseph Smith in a way that could not just satisfy the sources, but satisfy external readers. Let's talk about a few of those. The next major biography of Joseph Smith came out in 1977, written by Donna Hill, titled Joseph Smith, the First Mormon. It was initially published by Doubleday, was then republished by Signature Books a number of years later. It is in many ways the first academic biography of Joseph Smith that tries to offer some nuance in the believer perspective. Donna Hill was a member of the Latter-day Saint Church, but she drew academic tools and offered a flawed but genuine portrait of Joseph Smith. Very much more focused on the movement than Joseph Smith himself, but also very cognizant of the broader cultural context and fitting Joseph Smith within his milieu. Donna Hill's treatment was very much indicative of the new scholarly trend titled New Mormon History. I talked about this in a video just a few days ago on the evolution of the Mormon historical scholarship field. New Mormon history emphasized access to archival sources, which starting in 1970s, scholars were finally able to get more access to. They emphasized contextual background, so understanding the broader world, and they emphasized a humanistic framework to understand these historical figures in their time and separated from a devotional hagiographic history. Another important history book that came out a bit later is Robert Remini's Joseph Smith, a very short biography that fit into Penguin Press's larger brief biography series. Robert Remini was one of the most distinguished scholars of Jacksonian America, meaning the early 20th century, and so he emphasized how Joseph Smith fits into the political culture of the day. Now, during these last few decades of the 1900s, we get not just more access to primary sources, but we get a publication of Joseph Smith's own words themselves, seen most prominently in Dean Jesse's The Papers of Joseph Smith. 2 volumes was supposed to be a third, but that third one never came out for fascinating reasons. That laid the groundwork for the Joseph Smith Papers project that came later, a phenomenal collection of Joseph Smith's works, which allowed scholars to actually get more, a better view of Joseph Smith's own times, his worlds, and his activities. Reflective of all this new access to sources and the broader scholarly field that provides tools to analyze them, we get a number of scholars writing innovative essays and articles and monographs on the topics surrounding Joseph Smith. If you want a good taste of what those look like, Brian Waterman's edited collections, The Prophet Puzzle, published by Signature Books in 1999, collected some of the most important essays and articles on the topic that get you a sense of how the field of Joseph Smith studies was maturing. And then that field is going to get several landmark volumes in the first decade of the 21st century. In 2004, Signature Books published Dan Vogel's Joseph Smith, Making of the Prophet. This was by far the most deeply researched account of the early years of Joseph Smith. It only goes up to the first few months of 1831. In many ways, this book is a natural successor to Fawn Brodie because it viewed Joseph Smith as a fraud, not as a divine prophet. Dan Vogel uses the term a pious fraud to kind of capture the paradox of Joseph Smith. Unlike Brodie, this book is steeped in the primary sources. In fact, Dan Vogel spent so much time in understanding the primary sources of the early years of Joseph Smith, he put out a 5-volume series titled The Early Mormon Documents, which is still a really, really important resource to understanding those first few years. So even if you don't agree with all the conclusions of the book, and I don't, you have to wrestle with his arguments. When I was writing my book, American Zion, A New History of Mormonism, and I had a full chapter on the origins of the church, I had this book at arm's length at almost all times because it was a really good resource. And much of the book is actually an attempt to offer a naturalistic interpretation of the Book of Mormon. A majority of scholars, and in fact, I will almost say a unanimous opinion of scholars, is that Joseph Smith is the primary author of the Book of Mormon, whether you're saying that is divine of him translating plates or him naturally producing himself, meaning that a lot reject what is called the Solomon Spalding theory that Joseph Smith used other sources. And if you are going to make the argument that Joseph Smith came up with a Book of Mormon on his own, then you actually have to show that legwork. And this book, more than any other, I think, tries to show that legwork of what a naturalistic history of the Book of Mormon can be. So if you are wanting to understand the origin of the church, that book, The Making of the Prophet, is one of the most important to engage. The very next year, 2005, the 200th anniversary of Joseph Smith's birth, Knopf published Richard Bushman's Joseph Smith Rough Stone Rolling. Now, Richard Bushman was one of the most prominent scholars of early American history. He had won the Bancroft for one of his previous works, the most distinguished prize you can read or you can receive in American history. He had previously written a book on the origins of Joseph Smith and the Church, Joseph Smith and the Beginnings of Mormonism. Sorry, that's the title. And that was in the early 1980s. And he built on that foundation to publish Rough Stone Rolling, which is the landmark biography of Joseph Smith. It's a landmark not just in the scholarly study of Mormonism, because I believe that it was, up until that point, by far the best biography of Joseph Smith from cradle to grave, but also because it had access to lots of sources scholars didn't have access to before. He's able to place Joseph Smith in the broader contextual world of early Mormonism, and it was accepted by a broader scholarly field. That's not to say there weren't weaknesses in the book. There is an inherent problem that a lot of scholars are going to have with Bushman's Rough Stone Rolling, and there is an internal problem that is a result of the way Bushman framed it. Let's talk about the inherent problem, and that's because all historians frame their works around particular questions that's going to drive their research and their analysis. For Richard Bushman, his driving question is what led tens of thousands of people to believe Joseph Smith was a prophet and to follow him and be able to sacrifice for him. That questioning is going to then structure how the book is framed. That's not going to satisfy a lot of people who see Joseph Smith as a fraud, right? That's not going to answer the questions they have because Richard Bushman is asking a different question. So as a result, this book, Rough Stone Rolling, while widely accepted among many and most scholars, did not fully satisfy a general public outside of the LDS faithful who just don't buy the very basis of the book of Joseph Smith seeing himself as a prophet. I think that's unfortunate because I love the book. It's one of my favorite books. An internal problem in the book as well is that Richard Bushman is really great at so many great things of interpretation. Whenever I'm writing something about early Mormonism related to Joseph Smith, and I think I found some great, interpretation, I'll turn to Rough Stone Rolling, and he's already made it far better than I have. But there are some shortcomings, things not on his radar. I could mention a few. Maybe I'll do a video in the future focused on Rough Stone Rolling. But one of the critiques is he's not really cognizant of gender, and especially the women around Joseph Smith, and especially polygamy. You can't engage Joseph Smith without centering the problem of polygamy. And I think you can count the number of pages in this book that are devoted to focusing on Joseph Smith. And it's a thick book, to like 5 pages. And that's just not going to satisfy a lot of readers, which is why, some have knocked him for that shortcoming, in other words. The book also caused waves within the LDS Church. On the one hand, it caused a reckoning of many in the faith to try to see the Joseph Smith that did not match the narratives that they heard, the curriculum of the church, and many therefore denounced the church as faithless and critical and not up to steam, which is ironic because there are many others who said that he was too kind and generous to Joseph Smith. If you want to read more about Richard Bushman's own encounters with these two camps, he actually published a memoir with Cofford Books titled On the Road with Joseph Smith, which is very revealing and a really quick and I would say rewarding read. One more set of biographies I want to quickly mention. Signature Books had commissioned a trilogy of biographies that were initially supposed to be published around 2005, the 200th anniversary of Joseph Smith's birth. It took a few years for them to come out, but then eventually we got all three. And these are the Joseph Smith trilogy. First from Richard Van Wagenen, Natural Born Sinner, Joseph Smith, American Prophet, 1805 to 1830. Then we have Dan Vogel's. This was the most recent of the trilogy to come out, but it deals with the middle years. Charisma Under Pressure, Joseph Smith, American Prophet, 1831 to 1839. And then the one covering the Nauvoo years is Martha Bradley Evans, one of the best historians Mormonism has ever produced. Glorious in Persecution, Joseph Smith, American Prophet, 1839 to 1844. This American Prophet trilogy is, as you might imagine, because it is massive, the nerd's nerd accounting of Joseph Smith. It was really able to go into details and records far more than other scholars have. They have a very specific argument, each of these authors. I don't agree with all the interpretations throughout, and there are shortcomings. Dan Vogel's book, Charisma Under Pressure, is also kind of seen as a sequel to his Making of a Prophet, which I mentioned before, and it continues that naturalistic critical account, but it's also very deeply researched. And Marty Bradley's book about Nauvoo, I really like because it focused a lot on polygamy, which was needed, even if it is still relying on a lot of flawed sources like the History of the Church series. But if you are really into Joseph Smith, this is a trilogy you're going to have to wrestle with, which brings us all the way to this month, June of 2025. Now, many people know John Turner for authoring the biography of Brigham Young, Pioneer Prophet, published by Harvard University Press over a decade ago. It was an award-winning book, really regarded by many as one of the best treatments, even if I would argue it's mostly focused on 1850s Mormonism, which is where the Brigham Young story becomes most fascinating. John Turner is not a member of the faith. He teaches at George Mason University. He's written on a broad range of topics, and this month Yale University Press is publishing his biography of Joseph Smith, Joseph Smith, The Rise and Fall of an American Prophet. I was very privileged to read an early manuscript form of this, and I provided a blurb for the book, so I'm a bit biased, so I won't spend too much time critiquing the book, but I'll emphasize several things that I think the book does quite well. One is he deals with polygamy far more than Richard Bushman did. And just like his biography of Brigham Young, centered around the lives of Brigham Young's wives, we get a lot about Joseph Smith's polygamous relationships here that I think is very necessary. Two, John Turner is very adept at placing Joseph Smith within the context of Christianity and American religious thought in particular. That's his expertise. He focuses on American Christianity, so I think we get a lot there. And third, even though he offers a skeptical account of Joseph Smith, he doesn't believe that Joseph Smith had gold plates or saw, the angel Moroni. He still handles Joseph Smith very responsibly. So Richard Bushman's biography, Russell and Rolling, was not able to replace Fawn Brodie's No Man Knows My History because a lot of people still want that skeptical account. So I remember hearing Richard Bushman once speak that his goal was to replace Fawn Brodie on the shelf, but he ended up being satisfied if his book can at least go alongside Fawn Brodie's on the shelf in American homes. I really hope John Turner's Joseph Smith finally does replace Fawn Brodie's book because it's based in more accurate records. It's a much more scholarly account while still being quite readable. I mean, you can even compare this cover with the paperback cover of No Man Knows My History, and you can see the similarities that it's in many ways built, framed similarly, and I really hope it meets that important status. I strongly recommend the book. If you read it, please leave a comment below and let me know what you think. Like and share the video. These discussions of Joseph Smith often lack substance online, and I hope this video can provide more background so people can go out and do their own research and dig into Joseph Smith, who is an endlessly fascinating figure. Please subscribe to this channel if you haven't yet. History has never been more relevant than it is now, which is why these discussions are important.